thank you all very much for coming, and thank you for the invitation to speak here today. Now, you want me to hold this up?
Yep.
Yes? Okay. Okay, as an Australian, I need to acknowledge that the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose land the ANU, the university at which I work, occupies land, of course, that the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people have never ceded sovereignty over, have never ceded the sovereignty over that land. And I also need to acknowledge and pay my respects to the various traditional owners on whose lands I have undertaken the research that I'm going to talk to you about. Am I talking too fast?
No, it's the microphone.
Oh, it's not on? It looks... It's not on. It says it's on. Try again. Is that better?
It's okay, I hear
you. You hear me now? Okay. All right. So I was simply paying my respects to the traditional owners on the land on who the Australian National University and on whose land I did research, and acknowledging that sovereignty was never ceded. And I just give you a little warning here on the slide that I will be quoting or paraphrasing from some material recorded during interviews with visitors and tourists at World Heritage sites later on in the presentation. Right, and I've just realised I need to take my glasses off so I can see. And I realised too that I need my other glasses. Sorry. It's not good when you need 3 different types of glasses. Okay, so in July last year, I was interviewing visitors at Kakadu National Park, which is at the top end of Australia. It's a national park co-managed by the traditional owners and the Australian National Park Service. And I was talking to visitors or tourists about the meaning of the Indigenous site, which is this Indigenous rock art site, I should say, as part of a wider study looking at how World Heritage sites were or were not being used in the processes of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. I was about 2 days into fieldwork, and I was already quite alarmed at the casual racism that I was encountering. Many that I interviewed identified that they enjoy the aesthetics of these rock art sites. However, this enjoyment was frequently framed and expressed in rather flat and well-rehearsed emotions of either indifference to Indigenous issues or mild paternalism. From this sense of enjoyment, rather racist assessments and statements were made about Australian contemporary reconciliation issues and Indigenous peoples and culture. Now, what do I mean by flat emotions? These are emotions that are not hot or intense, like rage and hatred, but ones that were so well worn by the person expressing them that they just were. They were taken for granted, not noticed, and on which reflection was not required. Now, it's important to note that many Indigenous Australians live in poverty and are overrepresented in associated social statistics for incarceration, mortality, domestic violence, ill health, among many other issues. Paternalism and indifference to Indigenous peoples, their histories, their culture, and contemporary circumstances I was finding was not simply expressed by flat emotions, but was continually being remade, to draw on Michael Billig's idea of banal nationalism, by the banality of these emotions, by their everydayness. And this in itself was also reinforced by their flat intensities, where in fact, people were conforming, in a sense, to their expression. And they were also, in the way that these flat emotions were being expressed, comforted. And they were comforting in several ways. Firstly, because they felt in their everydayness like common sense to the people who were expressing them. But also because they were shared emotions. Like collective memory, these shared or collective emotions helped identify speakers as holding a particular social identity, in this case white, economically and socially comfortable, nationalistic Australians, and I do say with some relief, older Australians, that is older than 50. Now, sustaining hotter emotions of anger, fear, rage, hatred is hard emotional work. It is exhausting, although sadly, it's possible to say that more and more people these days are perhaps willing to put the effort in. But I want to argue that it is the flatter emotions that bring a sustaining sense of comfort that are far more difficult to challenge and change. This is not to say that rage and hatred are not there, getting thoroughly disheartened, but curious by the responses I was getting at Kakadu, I ended up gently pushing at the end of one interview, one visitor, and asked him a few questions about why he saw Indigenous peoples, as he had said in the interview, as being unable to engage in reconciliation, by which he meant that basically, that they should, basically abandon their culture and assimilate into white Australian culture. Now, as I gently questioned and pushed, he flashed with rage against Indigenous Australians, branding them with the usual racist slurs, and pointed to the rock art that you're seeing here before you and informed me that Indigenous peoples were liars. The art was fake. It was fake news, to quote him directly. Now, aside from the influence in this response of right-wing populist discourse about alternative facts and so-called fake news, what was interesting was that the rock art site, which had been curiously aesthetically appealing to him, had suddenly become the canvas upon which he had made material his hotter emotion of rage and his racist narrative of Australian society. The art as heritage had taken on emblematic justification for his rage. It was fake. On quizzing him on why he called it fake, he could not explain, except to say the colours were too bright for it to be old, here drawing on the questionable idea that heritage is meant to be old. Heritage sites are locations of political and agonistic tensions, mobilised not simply to assert the evidential rationality of claims to the truths of historical and national narratives, but more particularly as a locale where people can emotionally legitimise and invest in those narratives. Heritage as a representation of the inheritable past, of a past that has direct consequences to contemporary constructions of self, group and nation, becomes not only a target for contestation, but also a point around which to exercise and manage the emotional qualities of that past. So I want to explore today the affective or emotional qualities of heritage in its many forms, and argue that understanding the emotionality of heritage may offer some element of insight into the power of emotion and its ideological consequence. Certainly it is well understood that rational argument is not always on its own successful in persuading and eliciting change in political attitudes and beliefs. The left, as Stuart Hall, Alistair Bonnet and many others have observed, has been both reluctant in addressing the effective qualities of the past, often misunderstanding, if not overlooking it altogether, the role that emotions can play in cognition and making social and political judgments. The dismissal of nostalgia is a case in point, and it's often dismissed as simply a right-wing expression. And I and others have argued before, nostalgia is neither inherently politically conservative or backward-looking. Indeed, progressive nostalgia can be actively forward-looking and uphold agendas that want to change, for instance, the status quo. Nor is it only the hot or intensely felt emotions that frame and facilitate cognition and the making of moral and political judgments. So I want to argue that the flat emotions, emotions of low or everyday intensity, are far more sustainable and sustaining, and that they also do critical work in cognition and the formation and maintenance of historical narratives and social and political values that inform those narratives. So institutions like museums, who may wish to engage with current social debates and foster active messages about the nature of the past and its consequences for the present and future, I suggest that, in wanting to do that we need to understand the effective qualities of heritage. Indeed, both the new museology and critical heritage studies have called for interventions into public debates, an issue that is all the more imperative, I think, as the right increases its populist hold. However, before we can engage in interventionist acts, it is also important to understand the effective qualities and the repertoires of museums and other heritage practices, of which we may not always be aware and for which we may very well take for granted. Now, what I want to do is to provide a brief overview of how I'm theorising both heritage and effect. I then will identify the key points and their implications from my previous research on effect in museums and other sites of heritage making, to identify the emotional work that museums and heritage sites do, or that they're used by people to do, and that are often taken for granted. And then I want to illustrate what I'm saying with a current case study going back to Kakadu, and drawing out the repercussions of what the case study shows. Okay, so in my previous work, I've argued that heritage cannot be usefully defined simply as sites, buildings and other places or intangible elements in accordance with the UNESCO guidelines. Rather, heritage is a process or a performative practice in which the past is drawn on to help us make sense of the present. It's a process that is ultimately about the navigation of cultural and social change, as well as part of the mediation of contemporary social problems. No, that doesn't mean to say that those things, sites, buildings and other places or intangible elements, are not important, but rather what makes them heritage is how they are used. How they are used in the present to address present-day issues and aspirations. So I've argued that heritage and the values and historical narratives associated with heritage are something that is continually performed or continually made and remade. These practices of heritage making are framed by different discourses, and one of which, of course, is the dominant discourse, the authorised heritage discourse. Now, there are many, and I want to stress this, there are many other discourses that work in opposition to the authorised discourse or simply entirely independent of it. Discourses that, for example, both influence and are influenced by material social structures and concerns such as gender, class, race and ethnicity and so on. But the AHD, the authorised heritage discourse, is a professional discourse that tends to be continually reauthorised within international conventions and national policy, particularly in Europe. And it continually recreates heritage as something that is material, grand, if not great, with inherent and immutable values that must be preserved unchanged for the future. In this process, experts become the stewards for the past and interpret that past for the education of so-called non-experts or visitors or tourists or whatever. But the authorised discourse actually does more than this. It also defines the feeling rules and emotional repertoires of heritage. So the discourse stresses the emotionally grand, glorious and good, nationalism, pride, self-esteem and other positive and comforting emotions, particularly, you know, those emotions of belonging and well-being that we associate with heritage. It also stresses the idea of shared heritage, and that is something that is socially comfortable. These assumptions are so taken for granted that we often talk of dissonant heritage and the less positive or darker emotions of dissonance as something extraordinary and not part of everyday understanding or experiences of heritage. Instead, heritage, according to orthodoxy, should stress shared identity and belonging. So the authorised discourse constrains both our understanding of how heritage is understood and used in society, but also the role of emotions in heritage making and in professional heritage practices. So turning to affect. And it's important to note, I make no distinction between affect and emotion. This is because affect is always contextual. And it's always discursively and culturally mediated and cannot be reduced to an unconscious bodily response. Affect or emotion is integral to cognition, the making and justification of social judgments and to the processes of remembering. These emotions infuse all of this. And emotions play an important role in verifying recollections and the meanings of the past. If the processes of remembering feel right or are emotionally accurate, to use Adam Morton's term, or emotionally authentic, then those memories and the wider meanings and narratives they support are affirmed. Emotions are also the subject of feeling rules. That is, they are regulated by social norms, practices and social structures around which such things as gender, class and so on. And I draw here on Margaret Wetherell's idea of effective practice, which draws our attention to how affect and emotion are both influenced by and influence social relations. The idea of practice here notes that social actions, whether we're talking about practices associated with heritage making or other forms of practice, are always framed by emotionally laden discourses and social norms and values. Emotional responses are also influenced not only by cultural or social context, but I want to stress ideology. What a person chooses to care about and how they are affected will be influenced by political values and beliefs. And I'm drawing here on the work of John Yost, who argues that ideological positions and emotions help to frame the way an individual processes information. So, for instance, the psychological motive to manage fear and uncertainty is pronounced in political conservatism. Conservatives are identified as uncomfortable with social change, and that fear of death, fear of ambiguity, fear of change is linked to politically conservative tendencies to resist social change and to justify and accept inequality to maintain the status quo, even when that inequality is problematic for them, maintains their own subjugation. So in summary, I'm arguing that affect or emotion is a form of practice that is discursively framed and mediated. The heritage practices we engage in are negotiated and legitimised by the feeling rules and the affective practices in which we engage. Heritage meanings and narratives are all charged with emotions that work to renegotiate these or affirm and reinforce those meanings and narratives. Yeah. Slow down, I'm too fast. Okay, sorry. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm developing the concept of registers of engagement. And this is a concept I'm using to provide an analytical device for helping, I hope, analyse how emotions work to energise heritage making. And this idea acknowledges that individuals and groups will respond to those elements identified as heritage in a range of ways. Now, that's a pretty obvious statement, but traditional definitions of heritage tend to focus on the generative effects of unity fostered by heritage. Registers of engagement stresses that different modes and scales of approaching or using heritage will both interact with and recreate and legitimise emotional expression. It will be influenced by the intensity of emotional expression and by ideology. And intensity here recognises that people may vary in their engagement with heritage and the practices of heritage making in ways that fluctuate from the shallow and platitudinous to the earnest and passionate. So emotional valiance, recognising that emotions may also be expressed as both positive, such as things as joy, pride and respect, as well as negative, anger, distress, disrespect, for instance. Or that the suite of emotional responses in any heritage making practice may be a mixture of emotional valiances. Additionally, ideology, whether politically progressive or conservative, will also frame heritage making practices. These registers will in turn influence how the nature and consequences of heritage performance and the meanings and narratives that they'll influence the way that the meanings and narratives are constructed and reconstructed. Okay, so using that understanding of emotion or effect, my book Emotional Heritage drew on 4,500 interviews from visitors to 45 different museums and other sites of heritage in the United States, Australia and England. And I did this to map the effective heritage practices of museum visiting in Anglophone contexts. I interviewed at both museums of national history and museums that discuss specific histories around such things as labour, migration, Indigenous culture and histories of enslavement. So histories that were considered dissonant or contested. Now, I make no claims about the relevance of these results outside of those three countries, but I did find consistent patterns of emotional expression and practice that cut across all three nations. I also found that at different genres of museums, visitors expressed different sets of emotions, and at a number of and that a number of different effective heritage practices or performances could be identified. And these drew in different ways on emotional repertoires and feeling rules of different museum genres. The most prominent of these effective heritage practices was that of reinforcement. So in short, I found that the solid majority of visitors to museums did not come for education or learning, but rather to reinforce what they already knew, believed or felt. Indeed, as part of this reinforcement, visitors often rehearsed well-worn emotional responses that allowed them to emotionally reinvest in the historical narratives that they believed in and the values that underpin those. And there were two expressions of reinforcements that I want to draw your attention to. Those that are depicted here, that engaged in reinforcing their communal or individual self-esteem, and that their historical expressions and readings of history mattered. So these were a critical affirmation that the viewer, the person expressing this, the person going through the museum, that they and their history and their heritage mattered. So, going through this, these are all the first two are drawn from the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee. As the first person said, visiting the museum, it brings out some bad memories, but it also validates what kind of people we are to go through that and yet be who we are. So I find strength in coming to the museum. Reminds me of the importance of standing up for what's right, even if it's not necessarily safe or comfortable. So this is an effective practice of reinforcement. Nothing is being learned here. These people know who they are, and they know they know the narratives that the museum is expressing. They instead have come to reinforce their sense of self-esteem, their sense of pride. And this performance tended to occur at sites of marginalised history, for example, of labour and migration history sites, as well as the exhibitions on enslavement and those legacies. And statistically, it was carried out both at these museums and national museums by people from non-politically dominant ethnic identities, or who identified as working class, or who were the children, adult children of working class families. And these people were statistically overrepresented in this performance, this self-conscious, critical performance. Okay. The second version of this practice of reinforcement was far more prevalent, and it was far less conscious, it was far less critical, so not at all self-conscious. And as an act of reinforcement... Yes, sorry. Too fast? I'm still too fast. Yep, sorry. Slide number. This is the slide you're looking for next. So, yep. So this is the reinforcement that is uncritical, and this is a performance, as I said, that was dominant at the national museums, and it was dominated by, to a statistically significant extent, by people from well-educated, middle or upper class, from politically dominant ethnicities. So that basically people who identified as Anglo-Celts in Australia, or white British, or as Caucasian Americans. It was also undertaken in a flatter intensity or register of engagement. So the more critical one was a lot more active, alive. This one, matter of fact, banal. Okay, so what I'm arguing here is what is happening in this practice is a performance of social privilege, underpinned by a habitus of visiting that was emotionally comfortable, unreflexive, and reassured the visitor of their place in society. And what was also interesting was that when national museums tried to make interventions into these sorts of performances and attempted to challenge the national narratives of white middle-class visitors, such visitors tended to engage in an array of emotional and discursive responses that shut down cognitive dissonance, much like the fellow at Kakadu who cried fake news. Okay, so they would just basically not accept their challenges, and this was done through the use of platitudes and tropes that are often covert expressions of racism that could be prefixed with, "I am not a racist, but," for instance, "you cannot turn back the hands of time, you have to move forward, you can't judge the present on the basis, you can't judge the past on the basis of the present," and so on and so forth. These circular or self-sufficient arguments were taken as self-evidential facts, often expressed in flat registers that dismissed the dissonance and allowed the visitor to emotionally reinvest in what researchers from the Smithsonian refer to as their entrance narrative. Now, cognitive dissonance could also be challenged by more active registers of engagement when visitors became enraged. So, for instance, go back. My apologies. So, I should say with this slide, what's happening here is that the visitor is expressing cognitive dissonance, and they're employing employing those self-sufficient arguments. I'm not a racist, but we should all be treated equal. So here, this person from an Australian museum, what we did was quite horrendous to Aboriginal people, but the Aborigines weren't guilt-free either, they're saying. Inequality exists because of government handouts. We should be equal and treated equal. So if everyone's treated equal, there can be no discrimination is the argument, ignoring, of course, the fact that Aboriginal people are starting at a significantly underrepresented in a whole range of social equity measures. And this person here, responding to a slavery exhibition in white British, responding to a slavery exhibition in England, uses 3 of these arguments. You know, you can't turn back the hands of time. That's, you know, it's just the way it was 200, 300 years ago. You can't judge it from today. European countries have had just as much to do with it as England. So it's not us. It's not just us, it's everyone. So these circular arguments, as I said, are taken as self-evidential facts, and they're used to reinforce what the visitor already knows, believes and feels. Now, they were fairly often expressed in fairly flat emotions. Visitors, just to show you, could get quite angry. Here is a very, very angry visitor to to a site that had an extraordinary exhibition on slavery going on, a country house, a chateau, and she's furious. This exhibition is irrelevant. It's irrelevant, completely irrelevant. We haven't come to see this. Okay. But despite your fact, you can get very angry ones. Most people will dismiss their cognitive dissonance through these flat, banal, oh, you can't change you can't turn the hands of time backwards, all this sort of stuff. Now, I've stressed reinforcement, but I do want to note that some visitors did engage with the challenges to consensus national narratives offered to them by curatorial or interpretive staff. First, this occurred where the visitor was open to engaging with ambiguity and the challenges. And secondly, it occurred where the exhibition or interpretive content actively acknowledged the emotionality of the issue and consciously used those emotions. So of the 45 museums I studied, this latter was only achieved at 2 institutions, both of which developed strategies to foster imaginative empathy. Okay, so what are the overall implications? And I know I will speed up. I will not speed up. Sorry. So what are the implications? Okay, first, we cannot ignore the emotionality of the past. Secondly, if museums and other heritage institutions want to persuade and influence social and political debates, which we say that we do, we need to understand the effective practices of heritage making and how to both intervene in and support these practices. So both how to challenge the acts of reinforcement that are unconscious, but to support those that are politically conscious and we may wish to agree with. Okay, so to buttress this point, let's go back to Kakadu. Okay, and I want to use this case to illustrate how the left has failed to understand the emotional power of concepts of heritage and how this in turn appears to have bolstered racist right-wing populist positions in Australia. Okay, so the current research project is about, we asked a very simple question, do World Heritage Sites help with reconciliation or not? particularly as World Heritage Sites often get used in reconciliation discussions in my country, particularly in the context of the culture wars that we inevitably get caught up within. And the sites, there were 3 World Heritage Sites. This is Lake Mungo in Western New South Wales, a site important for pushing back the the Aboriginal occupation of Australia. Discoveries here by archaeologists in the 1960s and 70s resulted in the appearance of Sydney walls and protest banners of 50,000 years is a long time. So it pushed back occupation, which initially in the 60s had thought to be just a few thousand years, back to at least 40, but we now know that Aboriginal people have been in Australia at least 60,000, and I note Indigenous people argue that they have always occupied Australia and did not come from elsewhere, so have always been in Australia. And we also surveyed at the problematically named Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area. Problematic as wilderness implies it was unoccupied, a particular issue in Tasmania where the myth that the Palawa, that Indigenous people, had all died out remains strong. Nonetheless, Indigenous history at this site is a significant feature, and attempts to challenge the myth of Palawa extinction occurs. And lastly, of course, the third site was the rock art sites at Kakadu National Park. Okay. Now, the interviews were done in the lead up to, or not long after, the Voice referendum of October 2023. Now, Australians were asked to change the constitution in this referendum to establish an Indigenous consultative group to Parliament. That referendum failed, with 60% of Australians voting no, and note, voting is compulsory in Australia. Now, this referendum was part of the reconciliation process in Australia, truth-telling and the reconciling of conflicting groups being the first steps in this ongoing process. Now, Australia has been actively engaged in a long-term program of reconciliation since at least 1991, which was accelerated after the release of royal commissions into prison deaths and to the stolen generations, and several major legal challenges to the British occupation of Australia during the 1990s. But this process took a mammoth step backwards with the failure of the referendum. And the point to stress is that truth-telling and acts of recognition of Indigenous sovereignty and culture have actually been public, despite the loss of the referendum, have been publicly visible in Australia for some time, not least because various sectors of society and right-wing political entities continually push back at truth-telling and facilitate skirmishes in the culture or history wars. And we are constantly, every year, for instance, these issues are publicly rehearsed over whether or not we should change the date of Australia Day, for instance, as you can see on the slide here. So yearly tensions are played out over what one Conservative Prime Minister called the black armband view of history, which acknowledged colonial invasion and dispossession, and what the historian Anne Curthoys dubbed the white blindfold version of a dying race that was supposedly civilised by the arrival of Europeans. All of this was again rehearsed in the lead up to the referendum. Now, the referendum was marked by disinformation, particularly spread by the Murdoch press, and it was characterised by the right-wing press as an attempt to change our history and create division. It was also, I mean, it was a relatively straightforward thing. Do we want to allow an elected body of Indigenous people to provide advice to Parliament? But it was characterised by the right as too complex, with too many unknowns and hidden risks. And I'm embarrassed to say that the slogan on the right was, and the successful slogan on the right was, if you don't know, vote no. All of which played on fear of change, fear of ambiguity, and importantly, the fear and insecurity that lies at the heart of non-Indigenous Australian identities, that we are not the real or original Australians. Interestingly, the Labor government, the left-wing, well, supposedly left-wing, I don't know if we have a left, but anyway, the Labor government offered a factual response. If you don't know, find out, was their slogan. Here is the government website with all the information you need. 12 months out from the polls, it was thought that we were going to carry the referendum. But in the end, no, the idea of division was identified as the major influence on people's decisions to vote no. Okay, so turning to the interviews at the World Heritage Site. 208 visitors were interviewed across the 3 sites, and I used the basic survey in emotional heritage with the addition of a couple of questions at the end that broadly addressed reconciliation. Okay, skipping forward here. Once again, most people interviewed revealed that visiting heritage sites was about emotionally reinforcing or investing in what they already knew or felt. So for instance, here is a guy at Mungo. Yes, Mungo. You know, people have their own views. So looking after this place isn't going to change their views, but I think personally, you know, it's good to look after heritage sites, is what he's saying. This is part of the feeling rules of heritage. Heritage is about affirming who you are, what you think, what you feel, what you believe. The tendency in heritage practices to continually reference the idea that heritage is educational needs to be significantly rethought. No, it's not about education, it's about affirmation of what somebody knows about themselves, their community, and or their national identity, as this guy is saying. When asked about the role heritage in general or the site being visited played in peace building or reconciliation, many people offered positive general statements that tended to reference the assumptions underlying the UNESCO convention, the UNESCO constitution rather, the idea that, since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defences of peace must be constructed. So there's this sort of idea that it will just happen. We go to a heritage site and we will just feel better. We will just know and be respectful. And basically these extracts from the interviews is what people are saying, that somehow just being at the site will engender a sense of being humble and appreciative of what we have. It will just somehow engender a better understanding of what life in Australia had been and so on. So as I said, simply being seen or being told about the histories and heritage would somehow make people feel humble and appreciative. Some, however, went as far to talk about how the peacefulness of being in the heritage landscape would again somehow generate peace in people that would result in education and reconciliation. So this first person is saying that it's like a melting pot, being here that everyone can come and enjoy and get something out of being at this site, and we'll just, all have a shared heritage, a melting pot sort of heritage. it's really important to be here as a place for mental health and for refuge. And it's a beautiful place. Just the beauty of it will engender, as the second person is saying, engender a sense of peace, and so on. Now, the unlikeliness of this is made further problematic by the fact that what both of these speakers who are at the Tasmanian site are referencing is a trope in Australian society of the noble savage at one with the landscape. Nevertheless, these ideas are framed by the World Heritage ideas of peace building. But what they are in fact reflecting here is that, again, to repeat, heritage is about making ourselves feel good about ourselves. And that peace building and reconciliation will just somehow happen. Now, while some visitors talked about reconciliation as, and I'm quoting, the meeting of two cultures, many more identified that reconciliation had to tell both sides or both histories. So for here, we have a rather distressed person at Mungo saying reconciliation has to look at history from both sides instead of it being as one-sided as it is. We have to have the Aboriginal people reconcile where we've come from. While others explicitly saw reconciliation as inherently divisive because they were required to consider another person's heritage. So this person, the Aboriginal heritage, again, this is at Tasmania, the Aboriginal heritage is being preferenced over the Anglo heritage in this area by the national parks. So unfortunately, it's a matter of division rather than reconciliation. Now, these responses are based on racist discomfort with having to engage with the legacies of colonial history. However, there is a point to be considered. Reconciliation does need to engage with diversity of expression and experience. And I'm not legitimising the racism evident in these last extracts, but rather stressing that reconciliation does require an ability to see, understand and accept an entirely different conceptualisation of history, the present and aspirations for the future than your own. The effective repertoires or feeling rules of heritage simply as yet do not allow for this. Feeling rules stress the idea of comforting shared heritage, a universality that cannot underpin real peace building and reconciliation, which must by definition stress respect for diversity if it is to, if it's to succeed. So a failure to really engage with what this means leaves the default conventions of feeling within the Australian authorised discourse free to reinforce a culturally insensitive and paternalistic feel-good melting pot where diversity is ignored or disrespected. Now, at Kakadu, where interviews occurred after the results of the referendum, respondents were much more likely to reference, as I noted before, they were more likely to reference the failed referendum and the failures of reconciliation. References that were inevitably the overture into the visitor launching into quite overt but emotionally flat or taken for granted racist assessments about Indigenous Australia. So, for instance, and to paraphrase some of these, there were suggestions that in the past Aboriginal people knew their place better, while today they were more likely to be a political nuisance, that members of the stolen generations, that is children who were taken from their parents and raised in orphanages or in white institutions, were assessed as having higher IQs than other Aboriginal people and thus understood the need to conform to national values. Others identified Indigenous activism as an insult against the so-called civilising benevolence of white society. Now, as I noted at the start, these were not expressed in outright rage and hatred, but flatly and comfortably. They're taken for granted. Issues of reconciliation and associated calls for recognising diversity could be rendered unproblematic or dismissed. Interviewees took comfort in what they perceived as a shared performance of visiting the curiously aesthetic World Heritage Sites at Kakadu, often assuming, and often correctly, that other visitors shared their values and opinions. Visiting was a collective performance of seeing key Australian heritage sites and in doing so reinforcing the common sense, in Gramsci's meaning of the term, the common sense narratives about Australian past and present. Importantly, this performance was comforting. Hatred for Indigenous peoples was performed and recreated as banal indifference. The prettiness of the art could be enjoyed and comfortable affirmations of indifference and the social status quo between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people could be maintained. Any cognitive dissonance could be dismissed as fake news because the emotions these engendered were not emotionally authentic to the visitor. They were fake. On a slightly brighter note, younger generations, when asked about reconciliation and peace building, vaguely thought it was a good idea, but didn't see how heritage could help. While some noted that heritage could illustrate Aboriginal history, they expressed considerable uncertainty about the role of heritage in reconciliation. And I think this is expressive of several issues that highlight the effective nature of heritage and its feeling rules. First, the authorised feeling rules or effective practices of heritage stress the emotionally comfortable and, of course, pride and other uplifting emotions. Here, a person at Mungo notes, if I'm being frank, I think heritage, it's easy street. It's the path of least resistance. Yes, of course, you have to be informed, but I feel sometimes heritage avoids the big issues. And they go on to note that heritage facilitates people looking into the past. The present, as she notes, is where the issues lie and where heritage tends to stop rather than ask the questions of what next. Additionally, as yet another noted, heritage can be identified as being about stuff, about things, and not people. In this next extract I'm going to show you, the speaker is struck, so we're inside a little exhibition on this heritage site, and the speaker is struck by the representation of the thousands of generations that have occupied Mungo. So each black figure, I don't know if you can see them very well, but each black figure along that top there represents 10,000 generations. And they say, the imagery of the family on the wall, and I really thought it's when it started to twig. This is huge. Like it's like, this, you know, how can we connect the story of 10 metres of 10 generations? I mean, his mind is being blown at this point. Just can't get a sense of the time depth. And how does he connect that to today's conversations about reconciliation, peacemaking and truth-telling, or whatever it is, as he says? He can't, it's just conceptually too big. And he goes on to note that these messages get lost because he got caught up in seeing the pretty stuff. In this case, the shearer's shed on the site, which I assure you in the Australian context is pretty, at least it's romantic. And for him, the artefacts became the focus of the heritage gaze, and they do not translate people's cultural, historical experiences, especially when they were so very different from your own. So as he says, I just got caught up on the shearer's shed. Isn't the shearer's shed interesting? Because it's stuff like it's artefacts. But the big story, it's too hard to grasp. It's super hard to grasp. It's hard for Indigenous people to be able to tell the story in ways that connects with people when we just see physical stuff. Okay. Many people did mention how difficult it was for people to engage with the idea of Indigenous history, particularly at Mungo and Kakadu, because the sense of deep time at these sites is so confronting. People supportive of reconciliation question the ability of the World Heritage Sites to be used for these purposes, because conceptually of how far away non-Indigenous Australia's experiences were from Indigenous people. And because, as one person noted, this place is frickin' hell. It's hard to get here. It's hot, sweaty, and it's shit, and it's camping in the flies. So to conclude, what are the core takeaways from this case? The issue of how to cross the divide created by heritage feeling rules is an issue I want to stress. In any proclamation of heritage, there will be an unspoken assertion that this is mine and not yours, coupled with the contradictory expectation that heritage is also somehow shared. Also unspoken, excuse me. Also unspoken is the idea that heritage should make us feel unambiguously good and proud. And this is expressed both quietly and hotly. Heritage is about reinforcement and affirmation. Physical and emotional discomfort and ambiguity, on the other hand, are simply not part of the feeling rules for heritage making. They can be rendered as fake. These feeling rules and effective practices do not engender reconciliation or the challenging of right-wing racist positions. The campaign for a yes vote for the referendum, for instance, was not able to counter the no campaign's claims that the referendum would rewrite history and sow division. The no campaign asserted a particular idea of Australian heritage that rested ultimately on Indigenous people supposedly knowing their place, as some of those interviewed expressed it. The Yes campaign was unable to marshal a more inclusive and effective response that provided an alternative to fear, and more importantly, naturalised fear as a common sense through its flat ubiquity. So heritage is often touted by UNESCO and other organisations as a unifying peace-building exercise, and this entirely misunderstands the current effective practices and feeling rules of heritage. Maybe heritage cannot engage in reconciliation or peace building, or maybe museums and other heritage professionals and policymakers need to actively engage and subvert those rules to facilitate respect for diversity. I noted some visitors, particularly younger ones, were unsure how heritage may be useful in reconciliation, and I do think we need to help develop the discourse, effective practices and emotional intelligence that are needed here to provide that process of reconciliation. In turn, this means that we need to continue to actively re-theorise heritage in ways that challenge its physicality and aesthetic qualities, while opening a space to acknowledge and then engage with both its positive and negative affective or emotional qualities. It may be useful to consider that both everyday and extraordinary emotions are analytically important. Reconciliation and peace building is not simply about dialogical truth-telling, it is also about negotiating the emotional impact and tensions between differing expressions of history and heritage. So merci. And thank you very much for translating all of that. Sorry. Sorry, that was a bit awkward, but but if you have questions, points of disagreement, or other points you want to make, feel free. I'm quite happy to debate and discuss and answer questions.
Anaïs, je t'en prie, tu peux la poser en anglais et elle sera traduite en français ou en français et elle sera traduite en anglais.
Oh, c'est bon.
thank you for making it quite educational as well, because I'm personally a kinship anthropologist, so I'm not specialized in heritage.
Right.
But it did resonate quite a bit with a project I'm trying to write up about DNA. And this idea, I'm not sure there is an equivalent in English actually, but in French we say genetic heritage on quite a personal level. And it made me think of an article that I ought to read again from by Marlene Stratton about nostalgia and the new genetics. Now thinking, I probably understand it better. So my first question, I guess, is how, like, have you ever thought with all your theoretical baggage of those videos of like presumably like racist people, or I guess implicit racist people discovering, you know, they have DNA from Africa when they're claiming they're pure white, you know, and if you, and if you can elaborate on that, and then on the DNA test. And I guess then I have a larger like reflection, and I'm not sure I'll be able to really articulate it. But in the way I'm trying to think of all that, there's a report with time and how we represent how heritage, I guess, what's the relationship with the past. We always like think of it as it comes from the past to the present. But is it always the case, like in the way that different populations think of, you know, how they see the land and how they see what's transmitted to them? Like just this idea of transmission, does it always come from the past? So I guess it's not really a question. I don't know if it brings a benefit.
No, it does. It does. Okay. I'll answer the second question first, because it informs how I'm going to answer the first question. So there is the assumption that is embedded, a European assumption that is embedded in UNESCO, that heritage comes from the past and informs us in the present. It is our inheritance. However, I'm arguing that heritage is always in the present. It's always about the present. We constantly choose stuff from the past to bring forward into the present to help us deal with contemporary issues. And as many within critical heritage studies are arguing, that is a continual process of change. That certain things become heritage or perceived as heritage because there is a need in the present to see it and use it as heritage. And it may change and will change. We don't, you know, that it is not the past bringing its inevitable weight into the present and shaping the present. It is the present shaping its interpretation of the past, yes, and bringing what they think is useful for now to the present. And that shapes also the sorts of things that we see as heritage, whether it's monuments or buildings or stories that our nanas have told us, or how we perceive a landscape, music, poetry, whatever it may be. And also DNA. So for some, particularly within European context, DNA is perceived as vital in defining our heritage, what aspects of the past are important for us to consider. But that is a European understanding. So, and it is an understanding, of course, that has been used against colonial peoples to classify them and to make arguments about whether or not, arguments about the treatment of people. So I talked about the stolen generations, for instance. So in Australia, children who were perceived to have what was called white blood in their veins were taken from their mothers and supposedly raised white because they had the genetic, the racist assumption was that they had the genetic ability to be so raised because they had this DNA in them. And so, you know, a significant debate in Australia, as in many other colonial countries, is the legitimacy of the idea of blood quantum and DNA. Is it DNA that is important, or actually how we are raised and the culture in which we are brought up? So those are ongoing tensions, and they are tensions that underwrite the whole reconciliation process in Australia too. And of course, there is a significant conflict in Australia, in Africa, and across Asia and the Americas, to have DNA material returned to the descendant communities, because of course DNA is used by science to continually control and categorise people, and is used as a scientific argument for, you know, how people should be understood, whereas that is seen as entirely problematic in colonial contexts, where it is, you know, the argument is about people's culture and socialisation. DNA is just part of biology. I'm not sure if I answered the question. So yes, it's a huge issue, and yes, DNA can be conceived as heritage in the same way that a building can be, and it can be used in the same ways, or it can be challenged and not used, you know, as heritage. I think it is perhaps problematic, but it is just another side of conflict. It's another side of emotional attachment.
I have 2 questions.
Yeah, for sure.
First, thank you very much for your insightful presentation, and thank you for the translation. I may use peut-être profiter plutôt de la traduction, comme ça ce sera peut-être plus ambiance.
Oh. Yes. Sorry.
Ma première question porte plutôt sur le cas d'étude présenté avec les différents entretiens avec les visiteurs. Est-ce qu'il y a eu, est-ce que ces sites patrimoniaux ont conscience de la réception en fait de ces visiteurs, est-ce qu'il y a eu un retour envers eux, et comment en fait ils gèrent en fait, ils essayent peut-être d'instaurer un changement dans la manière de présenter les choses pour que ça ne génère pas de telles perspectives. Et le deuxième point porterait peut-être de manière plus large sur est-ce que ça fait encore sens aujourd'hui d'essayer de penser que les lieux patrimoniaux puissent être des lieux de réconciliation, sachant que ça fait peut-être plus de 20 ans que c'est une sorte de postulat, enfin quelque chose auquel ils tendent, vers quoi ils tendent, et en même temps on sent qu'il y a tous ces gouvernements qui deviennent de plus en plus réactionnaires, conservateurs, et que le racisme grimpant en fait empêche, on le voit aux États-Unis, ont des effets directs sur les lieux patrimoniaux, les muséums, différents sites liés au patrimoine. Ça complique encore plus l'idée que cette idée un peu idéaliste en fait des musées ou lieux patrimoniaux comme endroit de réconciliation en fait.
Is it fair that we consider nowadays heritage sites as places to use for reconciliation, because we see the commitments of policies and governments in it, but we know that it's been 20 years already like that, so do you think it still makes sense they can be considered as places we can use for reconciliation? So?
Yeah, can we still think we can achieve this idea of a place of reconciliation or is it a little idealistic since more and more governments are becoming very conservative?
Invasive,
Yeah,
conservative.
conservative. Is it still possible to have it like a solution?
Well, my argument is that no, at present, we make the assumption, we make the assumption that heritage, and this is embedded in the UNESCO Convention and it's embedded in the authorised discourse and the way we traditionally see in Europe heritage, that it will somehow engender this togetherness, this melting pot, this togetherness, that we will all, have that kumbaya moment of peace building and comprehend each other and so on. That will somehow just happen through the glories of visiting heritage sites. And I'm arguing that no, it doesn't happen. What actually happens is something entirely different, that people will go to heritage and construct not only construct reinforce their own narratives and understandings and beliefs, but it enforcing a reconciliation, enforcing sites to play, to bridge between two cultures, in the case as is the case in Australia, that you're setting up division, and in a way that doesn't facilitate reconciliation, because we just assume it's going to happen. So I'm arguing that heritage doesn't have the emotional or the effective practices within it to actually facilitate the sorts of coming togethers that we actually need. So at the present, no, heritage isn't about peace building and reconciliation. It can't be, because we don't have the language, either the emotional or discursive language, to actually engage with that. And I'm arguing that we need to develop, we need to theorise a deeper understanding of the emotionality of heritage and how people use heritage. So that's what I'm endeavouring to do. And I think you asked about where these sites are, so Kakadu is at the top end, right?
It was about the reaction of the visitors. Does the museum staff aware of this reception?
No.
Okay, so
No.
cannot.
Because we don't talk to... One of the things that we don't do in the museum and heritage studies is talk to visitors. We don't do it. We tend to, if we do, we tend to follow tourism studies and say, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you agree with this point that I've just made, in this questionnaire, rather than actively just talk to visitors, which is what I aim to do. I have 12 open-ended questions, and it's a huge amount of data, but my aim was to find organically, what do people think? What are they doing? What sort of memory and identity work are people doing as they tour these places? So at Mungo, for instance, the ranger who took people out on tours knew that the majority of people were being racist, buffheads is what we would say in Australia, racist, being unpleasant, that they were reinforcing what they already knew, because she had the questions coming back at her and the statements coming back at her. But on the whole, we don't know, because we often don't ask. Yeah. But yes, all three sites come from very different places in Australia. So Kakadu at the top, Mungo is somewhere down near the south in the middle, and Tasmania is right at the bottom. So very different, and all places were got to by car. No other way to get there. Yes.
Maybe 1, 2 or 3 questions.
Sure.
Peut-être en français ou en anglais, je sais pas. En français, une en anglais.
Okay.
In anglais, one in English. How can an emotion be evaluated, even identified or objectified in the field or during the survey? By lexical repertoire of emotion in speeches. Right?
So, sorry, I didn't quite follow you.
How can an emotion be evaluated or identified, even
Yes.
identified or objectified in the
Yep.
field or during the survey?
Yeah.
How can you do that? By lexical repertory
Yep.
of emotion with speeches, first way.
Yep.
By variation of modality of the voices, maybe. By some gestures or bodily attitudes. In French, there is an old sense of emotion that is about motion, internal motion, but also external motion, movement, mobilization, reaction, collective action. And by this way, in French heritage studies, emotional heritage is objectified by affective actions
Yes.
and reactions,
Yes.
and collective
Yes.
action, and often social with social situation in discomfort problems with heritage, distraction, misinterpretation, false senses. What do you think about this? How do you proceed?
Okay, good question. Okay, so I think historically we've been a bit shy about dealing with emotions because they're scary. In a so-called objective rationalist world, we're not meant to be emotional, okay? But being rational and objective is just another emotional state, all right? So emotion is in everything that we do. It influences the way we think. Sorry. It's at the basis of cognition. We're emotional all the time. We make it, So the first thing we need to do is to be able to say, we need to understand emotion, that emotion is part of what we do, and not be intimidated by this. That's the first thing, because actually it's not that hard. It's just looking out for what people are saying and how they're saying it and what they're doing with what they're saying. And people will tell you. So in the interviews, you could tell from, so so we did the interviews and then we transcribed them, and in that transcription we recorded everything, whether they were getting angry, whether they laughed, what sort of laugh it was it a nervous laugh, how long the ums and ahs were for, and also when we were interviewing, we had little codes that we would put against to say, because things like you can't see from the voice necessarily is that they're starting to tear up, yes, all that sort of stuff. So we then went through and we coded what people were saying, which included coding for the valiance of what they was and the intensity, the emotional intensity, what sort of emotion was being expressed, the intensity of it and the valiance of it. So all those things were being coded and looked at. And we also just asked people, how are you feeling? How does being at this site make you feel? And bizarrely, even the English could answer that question. So, but also you can see from what they're saying also how they're feeling, whether they're feeling angry or comforted. And one of the surprising things that came out of this for me was the sense of just the gentle sense of comfort that people took from going to sites that they believed represented themselves, particularly national sites like chateau and country houses or presidential houses or sites that told the national histories such as the American flag or the frontier histories of Australia or whatever. That's just how commonsensical it was, how banal that sort of comforting emotion was, but also how strong it was defended when people, when curators or interpretive staff attempted to undermine prized national stories, tried to draw attention to the fact America was built on slavery or Australia was built on the dispossession of Indigenous people and all this sort of stuff. When those unexpected interventions were made, the degree of energy that was put into reinforcing the sense of comfort that people got from going to museums and heritage sites was quite prevalent. And that they would engage, as I said, in an array of discursive ways. When we were talking about racial issues, you know, those "I'm not a racist but" statements would come out. And emotionally, they would reconfigure their emotions so that they would re-legitimise their sense of comfort. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now the French question.
Alors, d'accord, en français. Émotion et patrimoine sont très très proches, très articulés, très entremêlés avec les cas que tu as présentés, qui sont des cas à propos de mémoire de l'esclavage, à propos de relations entre indigènes et non-indigènes, à propos aussi de discours racistes ou racialistes. Ce sont des cas qui sont évidemment, qui ont des dimensions très politiques, très éthiques et politiques. Et donc ma question, très simple, c'est est-ce que les émotions qui apparaissent dans ces situations sont là pour des raisons patrimoniales ou pour des raisons éthico-politiques, ou est-ce que la question est mal posée?
Not 100%, but I think so. You're asking is the heritage emotion, the emotions that are struck, also part of the heritage? Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. That I mean, heritage. It's not a thing. I mean, these are cultural tools that we use to help us understand the past, and it's relevant to the present. Part of that is the emotionality and what we're constructing in when we define that something is heritage and say this is what it means for the present. We are making heritage. We're constantly making heritage, and emotion is part of that. So I don't think we can divorce, if I've understood your question right. I don't think we can divorce the emotionality, and that yes, there are certain emotions that get hardwired into our sense of heritage. So, you know, the idea of American patriotism is so hardwired there that certainly many of the people that I'd interviewed in national sites in America would see their patriotism as their heritage. Yeah. Whereas in Australia, we're more likely to see, now translate this from Australian English, we would call larrikinism, which is a sort of disrespect. Yes? A sort of comic disrespect as part of the heritage of being Australian, if you know. Yeah. So yes, I do. I mean, they're cliches, of course, but yeah.
Another question? Maybe another one. Magali. Okay.
It's to join this idea raised by Nicolas on the link between emotion and motion, and maybe emotion that can put in motion. What kind of maybe trigger you can identify on the moment where emotion could be maybe passively felt, like kind of resignation, or something which can put to action, put in motion, and maybe create a kind of involvement, engagement, citizen engagement, politic engagement. Is there in your material trials, interviews, etc. Something which can give an idea of this moment when emotion can put people in motion.
Yes, when it changes people's view.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So yes, you're asking me, is there data that shows how people may have changed their political position through emotion or their understanding?
Maybe have a better political
Involvement, yes.
after this reaction,
Yep.
or it's just like a resignation, or
Yeah. Yeah.
it's
Okay.
something like, but not the anger to and will to do something after that.
Okay. So one of the things I'm arguing is that in early emotional work, we tended to look at the big emotions, the hot emotions, anger, joy, happiness, and so on. And I'm also arguing that, yes, while those emotions are important, the quieter emotions, the ones that we don't even notice that we're having, are just as analytically important, maybe even more important. And I'm arguing they're even more important is that the quiet emotions, such as indifference, comfort, are much harder to challenge. They're much harder to see that we're having them and then to think about what those emotions do. So when we're feeling comfortable, we don't want to necessarily think about the experiences of the other or think about distressing political issues or whatever. So they're harder to unseat because most people will go to heritage to feel comfortable. So to unseat that sense of comfort, to get people to start to critically engage with cognitive dissonance, requires actually some fairly intense hot emotions to occur to unseat that comfortableness. And where that occurred in my data was when museums were able to successfully, or interpretive staff were able to successfully engender a deep empathy, imaginative deep empathy for the other. Now, empathy in and of itself doesn't necessarily get people to change their mind. You know, the idea of empathy is that you walk a mile in my shoes to understand me better. And we assume that empathy will therefore engender change. Empathy in and of itself does not, because you can have on the registers of engagement quite shallow empathy. Oh, I felt bad for this other during this museum exhibition. I felt sad. Got the t-shirt, don't need to think about it again after the exhibition. Or 5 minutes later, or whatever. And we had a lot of that. Oh, I felt very sad. And then total shift and started talking about the things that were important to them. In 4,500 interviews, I had 4 people say to me, oh my God, I had never thought about this. I am going to leave this museum and think about things differently. I also had 9% of visitors say, actually, I've had some deep new knowledge or new ideas, or so not very many. But when it did occur, it was because they were, and it was a joint thing. The museum needed to, so where it occurred, the museum was understanding that emotion is important and was using, if you like, manipulating people's emotions actively. But it was also met by people who were emotionally intelligent enough to be able to engage with that and see it. Okay, so it was a two-way street. And what happened was that the empathetic response was deep enough. It got to their core enough, if you like, and could be coupled with a good dose of imagination to be able to go, oh, I just never knew. I didn't know. So so the two, so there were, okay, so when this happened was when the museum, the Immigration Museum in Melbourne was one of these sites. It had an installation in which people had to do role playing, and that really got to people. A museum in Bristol also really got to people because they had an actor reading the diary of a 12-year-old who was sold away from her mother, and that got people. So when it brought it personal, it made the situation personal, it brought it to a human level, and it engendered empathy. National Civil Rights Museum also had a high degree of people going, oh my God, because, again, there were personal artefacts from King there, letters and so on that people read and went, oh, you know, I'm hearing his words through these letters and sort of stuff that made people tear up and cry and these sorts of things. So it was the personal, coupled with imagination, coupled with the ability to generate empathy, a deep, sincere empathy. Mm.
Do these museums have policy granting residencies or maybe white card, something to invite communities or indigenous artists and give them the space and sharing authority?
Yes.
Or is this something not really?
Well, some of the museums did that I was at, yes. Okay, so all right, so yes, okay, I'll just look at a subset of sites which looked at enslavement in America and the UK. And some of those museums had a very active program of bringing African artists in and doing installations. Some did not, but all of them attempted to have some sort of intervention from the local African American or Caribbean British communities, right? That had no more nor less impact on visitors' responses than any other aspects of the exhibition. So, you know, I go back to the point that people who are politically conservative will see what they want to see. If they're not open to the challenge, they won't see the challenge. If they are open to the challenge, they may see it. They may have the emotional intelligence to deal with it, but often they did not. Interestingly, one of the things that was significant in the statistical analysis was that people with higher education degrees, all of us in this room, had a whole lot less emotional intelligence than people who didn't go to university. That we've been taught to think about things in certain rigid ways, and we would miss the emotionality often. Those who hadn't been to university, I know it's sad, eh? Who hadn't been, were a lot more open to those sorts of artistic interventions, yeah? Another researcher at University of York, looking at art galleries, found the same phenomenon, interestingly enough, and depressingly enough. So it's a lot less of. So what I'm saying, it's a lot less about actually what we're doing than we think, and it's a lot more to do with the emotional intelligence and skills, both of ourselves and the visitors to the museum. So one of the things that we were arguing in the study we did on the slavery museums was that actually we needed to provide the emotional space in those exhibitions so that people could develop the emotional intelligence that they needed. So often people, when white, British, Caucasian American, and the same goes in Australia for Anglo-Celtic Australians dealing with Indigenous stuff, their first response is to feel shame and guilt, and they don't want to feel shame and guilt, and they don't want to do it. And we were arguing we needed to be able to say, how do we move beyond shame and guilt? How do we develop the emotional intelligence, the emotional skills to move beyond that shame and guilt? Yes, there will be shame and guilt. Get over it, handle it. How do we move on from that to something that facilitates reconciliation? And that's what we're arguing. That's what I'm arguing, that we need, it's not just about the facts of the case in telling the story, it's also the emotions that are important in telling that story. And it's also important for us to develop the spaces in exhibitions and heritage interpretation for people to feel and to give them the resources they need to move their initial, I don't want to feel that, to, oh, it's okay. Oh, I now understand. Yeah.
Maybe just with the permission, last question?
Yeah.
Okay. Question about the kind of emotions you deal with. I saw two sources of emotion in the cases you studied. Emotions caused by heritage elements by themselves, by their own strengths, paintings,
Yep.
one side. And on the other side, emotions caused by heritage devices created by museums,
Yep.
curators, exhibition designers, and so on. And do you make a difference between these two sources, or is it not relevant for your purpose?
Well, for my purposes, it is a little bit relevant, but not really. Ultimately it is relevant because I want to see who's doing what.
Yeah.
But initially my research was just to find out, well, what are people doing? But there are lots of examples in the data where, people can identify it was this instance of seeing this artefact that made me think or whatever. But again, it's not as simple as open up an exhibition and people will come. People make choices. First they make choice to come. Then they make a choice to see certain things or not see certain things. Then they make a choice to feel things or not feel things. And it's quite complicated. One of the most complicated interviews I did was this middle-aged woman at a plantation site that was in America, that was the house of one of the famous founding fathers, right? There was also, he had slaves. And she went on the tour of the site, and it was all this glory. She was telling me about how patriotic she felt because she sat in the library where the Constitution had been written, and oh my God, it was wonderful. And she looked at the painting of this guy's wife who was important in American history, and it was, she fell in love again with this wife, and so on and so forth. It was as I expected. And she made that choice because then she made another choice. She broke off from the formal tour, and she went down to a part of the site part of the plantation that wasn't part of the tour, and it was a little railway station that had a door on the railway station for whites and a door on the railway station for colours. And she said she went and walked through that coloured door, the door marked coloured, so that she could feel something about what it was like for her friend who was African American growing up in the South and experiencing racism. And she knew it was a prosthetic thing. She was not really feeling, was not really experiencing it. But she used that to really think about how racism was very much, as she said, part of her family heritage, and how she needed every day to fight against the racism of her family. And she was in tears telling me this. I mean, I was actually, holding her up at one point because she was sobbing on my shoulder about the racism in her family and how both patriotic she was, but also how devastated about the racism in her family and her society. So people do quite complicated things, and they can do two things at once. And but the point about that is that they make choices. She made a choice, and I think that for me was quite a revelation that we make choices based on our ideological positions and so on, which means, to say the last thing, which means that we can try all that we want as a museum, as an educator, as a heritage interpreter, and so on, and we know we will not sway everyone, of course. Of course, we know that, yes. But again, if we wish to be more effective and more transparent in what we're doing, then I think we need to engage with the emotionality of what we're doing.
Okay. Last.
Yes, sure.
En français.
Yeah.
Donc, merci pour votre conférence. On a pu apprécier dans votre présentation et celle de Nicolas au tout début les travaux qui ont marqué votre trajectoire scientifique. Comment souhaitez-vous faire évoluer ou approfondir vos recherches sur les questions patrimoniales dans les prochaines années?
Yes, where to next? That's a good question. The work that I'm very interested in now is looking at how heritage is mobilised within right-wing populist movements. That's what I'm very interested in, and I have research grants in Australia, which, fingers crossed, hopefully will come out and I'll be able to do that research. But I also think another area that I would like to research, and I probably will never get the chance, but another area is I would very much like to be engaged with a museum or heritage interpretation site and go through the processes of looking at audience responses, and then again looking at audience responses as the museum changes its interpretive strategies, and look at strategies that attempt to engage the emotions and do this work again. Are we seeing the changes that I'm predicting are going to, or hope will occur? So that's the next step from this particular research. But the one that is I mean, I would love to do that, but that's a longitudinal research, and I probably won't ever get to do it, but I think there is work there that needs to be done. But yeah, at the moment, it's in Australia, it's carrying on from this reconciliation is looking at what went wrong with the referendum, what went wrong in how we talked about the culture wars and the history wars, how was heritage mobilised in that, and what can we do, how can we use heritage in ways to challenge the racism and right-wing politics in Australia. That's what I've got a grant in for, so we'll see. I probably won't get it, and I will never get to do that, but we will see. Thank you. Oh, merci. Thank you very much for staying the distance.
Merci. Peut-être dire en français un mot sur le fait que le séminaire de l'Axe Patrimoine continue encore cette année, puisque nous aurons